I'm waiting now for Anar Akhmedov. He's one of the most brilliant minds when we're talking about development and political economy. He made a doctorate in London School of Economics in political economy. So I'm very excited for him to come now so we can start talking about how we can develop Azerbaijan economically and politically. Thanks for coming. I have a few questions. Let's start with the first question. So let's imagine you are advisor to Azerbaijan's leadership and they ask you a very simple question. What is, in your opinion, should be future development strategy of Azerbaijan in regard to Armenia?
Okay, yeah, there are a number of things to remember to set up the context first. The first thing we need to remember is that the situation remains dynamic. In that dynamic situation, it's very hard to give good advice because that good advice might become irrelevant or counterproductive tomorrow. So assuming that the situation stabilizes to some extent, then a number of things that Azerbaijan's leadership might want to do. The first principle should be there is time for celebration, there is time for grief, and there is time to act gracefully towards Armenia and Armenians. What I'm trying to say is Azerbaijan would only win if it does not repeat the mistakes that Armenia committed in 1990s against Azerbaijan. Whether it was the majority of the population or Armenian leadership or someone else, it doesn't matter. Overall, Azerbaijan in 1990s faced humiliation, suffering, grief, a huge bias that was developed by Armenian diaspora abroad, and Azerbaijan was pretty much alone in this. And that was a very, very negative burden to carry with it for decades. Azerbaijan should act gracefully towards Armenia and Armenians. Of course, that doesn't mean sitting back and not responding proportionately, but still acting gracefully and I would say graciously is important. In order to solve the Karabakh problem in long term, Azerbaijan needs to carry out some of the reforms that it has not been able to pursue before. So only if those reforms are pursued, Armenian citizens of Azerbaijan would have incentives to come back, not fear persecution. They would have economic incentives to come back or live peacefully, right? So Azerbaijani leadership would only win by using the current huge political capital that it has gained over the last several weeks domestically to pursue reforms in several sectors that it has started several years ago, but with little success. And that includes, first and foremost, economic reforms, particularly on diversifying and demonopolizing a number of sectors. This is very crucial. That would also enable it to sort of pursue, to some extent, trade links within the Caucasus region and beyond. The second is to remember that, let's say, biased parties outside of Azerbaijan, biased against Azerbaijan, they are thriving on stories of how autocratic Azerbaijan's political system is, how it represses dissent, and how it stifles economic development, long-term economic development. So a certain degree of gradual, well-thought-out political liberalization has to be there. It has to be tangible, it has to be visible, it has to be something that is clearly signaling a change. Let's say, for example, releasing political prisoners, reducing limitations on media, opening up civil society. Now, why is important as well isn't only because to sort of win over Armenians and win over Western constituencies, Western observers that are watching warily at Azerbaijan. It's not only because of that, but this sort of political liberalization is important to avoid an escalation of militarization in both countries. So what I'm trying to say is this. In many countries that are just out of war, whether it's international war or civil war, there are lots of capable fighters coming back. They are wounded. They are full of pride in this particular situation. They are victors. They have delivered victory. They need space to breathe. They need economic opportunities for themselves and for their families. So to avoid that kind of potential, that kind of energy coming both from the fighters and from the society, and we see it in front of us, right? That there's a lot of energy in the society right now. That needs to be channeled creatively and to constructive means, rather than allow it to sort of breed and lead to something not very, not at all needed. Political liberalization means decentralizing where it's possible, to let civil society do what it's good at, to let people pursue economic opportunities when they can, rather than trying to control the situation and sort of try to manage all in a very centralized manner. So that can become counterproductive. So it is also, from outsiders' perspective, it's very easy to say those things. It's very difficult to actually do this, right? And it has to be very clear. And I think astute observers of the situation in Azerbaijan and balanced, impartial experts very well see how difficult it is for the leaderships of both countries, Azerbaijan and Armenia, how difficult it is for them to have any room for maneuvering, given how galvanized their societies are and what unfriendly geopolitical environment they face. So it is, what I'm trying to say is, we shouldn't just put it all on them and say, oh, do it. But what they can do, in the case of Azerbaijan, is to move towards tangible steps in gradual political liberalization to let the steam out in productive ways. Another thing to look at is education system. Over the course of its post-Soviet history, Azerbaijan has not done so well in education reforms. Now there is some window of opportunity to sort of correct that. You have a Western educated, bright group of people within government who were pretty much hand-tied. They could not do much, right, because of the environment that they are in. But now there is a room for them to pursue some reforms, and that should include education system as well. Not to sort of prepare for another propaganda information war, although this might be a tiny part of it in future, but to make sure that Azerbaijan develops sustainably by producing high so-called human capital that can create jobs and create economic opportunities without oil and gas resources. So if you look at the success stories in East Asia, you see that many of them did well not because of they did well precisely because they did not have the advantage, the privilege of vast resources, right? Look at South Korea, right? Look at Hong Kong and Taiwan and Japan. So it's important to develop without oil and gas resources. You need to go into sectors that require high level of human capital. They require high-tech skills. Only a good education system can produce that. And that is what we should strive for. Whether it's realistic and to what extent is a different question. But sort of tilting towards that, clearly changing trajectory from basically an education system that works on allocation. Yeah, the state budget has this amount of money, and it just says, oh, this university gets this university gets that. And however, regardless of how they manage their resources, they keep getting their resources. That should not be the case anymore.
Just taking from this answer of yours, I want to lead to another question it's a question about financial resources. Rebuilding Karabakh will demand enormous financial resources. Where do you think Azerbaijan can take those resources from?
Okay, so numbers wise, there are some resources within Azerbaijan's bank accounts that it can use for reconstructing Karabakh. Now, and when I say Karabakh, it also means the seven adjacent areas. Some of them are sort of geographically Karabakh, Lower Karabakh, and some of them are not. Now, those resources, for example, the State Oil Fund, last time I checked, it had more than 40 billion on its account, $40 billion US dollars. The reconstruction can take, tens of billions, right? Clearing it from mines is also a huge deal. Now, it's not prudent, and the Azerbaijani leadership probably understands this, that this is not realistic to pour, whatever money you have towards that, right? You have a huge economic sort of need in areas outside of Karabakh, right? Especially with COVID-19. Now, where this money can come from, well, initially probably it will come from the State Oil Fund's reserves, so assets. It should not come from Azerbaijan's foreign exchange reserves. But to make it long term, there needs to be some degree of economic openness, economic liberalization. Now that means demonopolizing certain sectors, allowing some breathing space for economic actors to do what they're good at. Some of this money for reconstruction can and perhaps should come from international development organizations. So the World Bank, EBRD, and others have large-scale infrastructure projects. They would be interested, if they are persuaded, to invest some money in reconstructing and building the infrastructure in and around Karabakh that is needed to some economic activity being resumed in those areas. So without infrastructure, without sort of sunk costs that go into building roads, into sort of building some buildings and putting posts here and there, you cannot have economic activity, right? Economic activity doesn't just thrive and pop up out of nowhere, right? There needs to be some infrastructure. So initially, it can tap into some of the reserves of the State Oil Fund, but that's not necessarily a good idea, and it has to be very frugal with these resources. So the advantage of a gradual economic liberalization, not shock therapy, liberalization that we saw in Russia in 1993, which devastated Russia and all countries around. That was, by the way, advocated by a number of US-based economists. Now, Azerbaijan should avoid shock therapy, but gradual economic reform that allows generating economic activity, that generates money for taxes, that then can be taken by the state and reallocated, redistributed to those areas. That's what is needed. And last but not least, and this is something that unfortunately has not been flagged so much. Unlike 20 years ago, 25 years ago, Azerbaijan did not have the Republic of Azerbaijan. I'm not talking about our kin in Iran that have been living in Western countries and elsewhere for decades. I'm talking about diaspora that comes from the Republic of Azerbaijan with strong attachments back home. 20, 25 years, it was a tiny group of people. Now it's not. They have resources, intellectual resources, some have financial resources, many have both, many have other resources, right? Social capital that they can bring. This diaspora remains a relatively untapped source of development aid to Azerbaijan. I don't want to run into an extreme of saying, oh, it's going to be like Indian diaspora, which basically channeled so much remittances inside India that counts for a certain visible part of India's becoming a sort of success story. Our resources, the resources of Azerbaijan's diaspora are much less, but it's not trivial. It's not negligible. Now, how it can be tapped into? Well, start with Azerbaijan's legislation. There are things in the legislation that are aimed at sort of controlling monetary financial flows into non-governmental organizations for a variety of reasons. That's a different discussion. But that also ends up penalizing Azerbaijanis who want to sort of channel remittances and invest back in Azerbaijan. What they need is, first of all, an ability to do that unimpeded. Second, for those who are investors, they need a safe, secure investment climate. Without that diaspora as a source of economic aid, if you will, remains relatively untapped.
I have two more questions that are interconnected, so I want to ask them at once. First, you talked about economic liberalization, but also political liberalization. What do you think should come first, or should they come in parallel? And also, from that question, economically speaking, the strategy of developing Azerbaijan economy for next 20, 30 years. Is it possible? Is it actually possible that Azerbaijan becomes one of the richest and most developed economies in the world within the next 20, 30 years? And if yes, how would you imagine this happening? What should be policies of Azerbaijan so it actually happens? Because coming back to previous points, at the end of the day, our peace with Armenia, our economic development, management of political situation within Azerbaijan, it will all depend on how economically successful we'll be.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Now, so to answer your first question about whether political or economic liberalization should come first, first of all, these things are very hard to separate. Analytically, you can separate them. But in practically, this is very hard to do. So an answer to your question, a decent answer could be, well, they should go hand in hand. Because, for example, if a couple of established entrepreneurs are, for some reason, having to do with their competitor who has political links, if one day these two entrepreneurs end up not doing well and end up being sort of, repressed in some way or another, is it economic forces or political forces at work? So economic and political liberalization should go hand in hand. And the reason why they will probably, if they take place, go hand in hand is precisely because you can't do better otherwise. Well, why? Because economic liberalization and political liberalization isn't, smoothly developed sort of long-term strategy that then you implement piecemeal, one step after another, right? So you can plan as much as you want, and you should, but when it's actually implemented, it's going to be a different scenario. So you should move gradually, one by one, liberalizing here in economic terms, liberalizing here in political terms. There are some things that are relatively straightforward to do, and they are politically not costly, or very little. They have very little political cost, but the advantage, the benefits are big, right? So, for example, releasing political prisoners, I might not see, and you can't persuade me otherwise, I might not see the costs of it, but I might not see a lot of cost to it. There are potential costs for the leadership of Azerbaijan, but I see a lot of benefits as well, especially now. So doing that and taking off some limitations here, and then pursuing another reform there in a year, is a viable strategy, right? So now, coming back to the second question, is it, in my view, is it feasible that Azerbaijan becomes one of the most developed countries in 20-30 years? It's very hard to say. It's very hard to say, not because Azerbaijan lacks that potential, but you need to be realistic about what Azerbaijan has, and very importantly, that it is still a small country. It is a small country surrounded, embedded in not such an economically vibrant neighborhood, in not such a friendly geopolitical environment. So I have all respect towards people and leaders in countries like Czech Republic. But Czech Republic is surrounded by economically vibrant, established, consolidated democracies. Look at Azerbaijan. So it's very difficult to implement economic reforms when at any point in time a high-level, well-connected Russian oligarch wants to do something in Azerbaijan, right? So it's very difficult to sort of keep political game going while also allowing economic reforms to proceed, right? And also there is a huge resistance within Azerbaijan that has connections elsewhere, and they will resist reform. Now, despite this, there is right now, if there is at any point in time, if there is a window of opportunity, I would say it is emerging soon, provided that the situation does not go into a very destructive dynamic, in relation to Armenia and Russian presence and so on. So what is possible is this. Now, Azerbaijan has had an oil boom. Azerbaijan has built up a large physical capital stock. It has invested in human capital with some degree of success, but also, not so well as to be able to say, well, now we have a labor force capable of building computers, right? Now, if you ask me, I would say there are at least two things that can be seen as an opening. One is that given the energy that is in the society right now, and given the second factor is given declining oil and gas revenues, this is a window of opportunity to sort of change gears and put the country onto the trajectory of an economy based on manufacturing rather than on producing, extracting and exporting raw materials. So what I'm trying to say is it's good news in a way that we are running out of oil and gas resources. There is an economic potential in several sectors. Talking about tourism right now, unfortunately, is sort of, hopeless dreaming probably, given the COVID situation. But tomorrow, if the situation subsides, that is a small but visible sort of source of money. Especially if the situation stabilizes around Karabakh, it would be one of the good sort of sectors that can develop. Because previously, if several years ago, many tourists from Western countries would not want to come to Azerbaijan because, the story is like, well, it's a frozen conflict there. Second, they would rather go to Georgia. Why? Because Georgia is cheaper and Georgia has a much better service sector. And that's not necessarily because, with all due respect towards my Georgian friends, and I love the country in general, but with due respect, Azerbaijan and Armenia can develop similarly given a favorable environment. In Azerbaijan's case, it means actually running out of petroleum resources can make you a bit more competitive. The prices can be similar, but also there is an incentive to develop better, to cater better to international tourists and so on. But so agriculture, tourism are just two sectors and they're not making a lot of money, right? So altogether, I wouldn't say that they make more than 10% of the country's GDP. It's very difficult to develop. What can be done is there are other sectors. There are other sectors that can be developed, including petrochemicals. So you don't necessarily have to produce yourself, extract yourself, but you can manufacture things that come from others. And of course, there are other things in which you can sort of look much more serious than before. For example, renewable energy. So along the coast of the Caspian Sea, there is a potential there. It has been explored, but so little as to not tell us, based on the information that I have, it hasn't been investigated seriously how much renewable energy potential can be along the Caspian coast and within some area of Azerbaijan with a lot of sunshine. And given the climate change, this is one of the hugely prioritized issues, and that should be on the agenda of our leadership.
But do you think that the government should, let's say, define and say that these are 1-2 priorities in our economy, or do you think they should more let the free market decide what will be the sector that business people from Azerbaijan and from around the world will come and decide and shape the economic future of Azerbaijan, and the government needs just to create environment, the framework for businesses to operate in a way that they would want to start business in Azerbaijan, B to continue business in Azerbaijan, and it would attract many investors, and how this framework can be created, because despite all the reforms that we have seen in the last, I would say, maybe even 5-10 years, I've heard some business people, friends of friends, they said, before we would, actually it was better before we could pay bribes and our businesses were viable, even, through customs, but now, we need to pay the proper taxes and, the business doesn't make sense anymore. So there are a lot of, or we see our friends, business people, they complain about bureaucracy, in customs, when oil and gas business started in Azerbaijan, there was this, remember, very enabling environment. Basically, this total laissez-faire. The Azerbaijan legislation didn't even apply, to these oil and gas companies. And what about developing this economy? I mean, do you think what should be a specific strategy of Azerbaijan government in this regard?
So first of all, I would separate what I see as two different issues that you sort of highlighted. One is the issue of establishing a level playing field, providing public goods such as rule of law, to create a business investment friendly environment. That Azerbaijani government, well, Azerbaijan's elites, let's say, they need to make that, they need to do that regardless of the second issue. The second issue being looking for what the comparative advantage is. So first of all, creating business-friendly environment, secure property rights, rule of law, and lots of other public goods provisions that make sure that investors, when they come, they feel secure in thinking that, okay, so it's a place where I can invest and I'll make profits and no one will expropriate it from me when things go wrong very quickly like this, right? Now that's one issue. The second issue, so in the first issue, the government has to sort of assume lots of, like, a huge role there goes to the government. Civil society, which has shrunk a lot, can't do much in that regard, right? Now, the second issue is whether basically the government of Azerbaijan should decide what priorities are there. What is the comparative advantage? They say, oh, our comparative advantage, the economic advantage in producing A, B, C, we can do that better than others. We will be able to export it relatively cheaply, and then we will compete with Argentina in apples, for example, or some sort of basic cars. We will compete with Belarus, and we will beat them because we can produce it with quality but cheaper. Now, who should do that? The government should do that, right? 1, 2, 3. This is a comparative advantage. Put money, develop. The second is, as you said, let economic actors or let economic forces to come to that conclusion by themselves, by trial and failure, right? Let startups rise and fall. Those who will be creating, viable businesses that can survive and create value and employ people and so on will survive. That's the second logic. Now, my approach to that would be you need to have a mix of both. Why? Because there are dangers in falling into any of those two extremes. In the first one, of course, there are at least two dangers. One is that you assume that the government, a highly centralized body, can sense what's going on in a society, right? It can know. I highly doubt that. I highly doubt if it's not at all an original thing to say. It's pretty banal that one thing that was demonstrated by the failure of so-called socialist countries was precisely this highly centralized planned economy. That assumes that those at the top can know and can plan and can decide well. The second problem, especially in the case of Azerbaijan, is that when you do that, then the question arises, okay, so if the government has decided to develop A, B, C sectors, how will it decide to allocate contracts? So for example, if it wants to develop that sector, right, will government subsidy to develop the sector A go to a winner that has been found out, that has been that has emerged through a competitive bidding procedure, or will it go to one of the well-connected oligarchs? So we know what the answer has been in recent history. So that scenario should be avoided. So there are dangers with government government deciding on what comparative advantage is. The danger of letting market forces to decide is also, it's a deeply flawed neoclassical economics thinking that has been shown wrong over and over. Unregulated markets, they are blind. If you one thing that John Maynard Keynes, one of his better contributions into economic thinking, was precisely that he showed that if you don't regulate, the investment doesn't have reasons to go into long-term sort of societally friendly investment. It's just going to go into sort of gambling on the stock market, right? Which leads to instability and all sorts of problems. So letting market forces to decide by themselves is an ideologically sort of driven assumption. Yeah? So what can and should perhaps be done is a mix of things. A mix of things, meaning, for example, look at the experience of sort of the East Asian tigers again, right? Or other countries actually, where there were public-private partnerships, there were public-private sort of committees where government officials, right, particularly those who are sort of true technocrats, they would sit with members of economic elites and not necessarily elites, as well as civil society, to sort of decide on these topics in a more sort of dynamic way. Whether the government is willing to do that and is capable of doing that, we will see. But that is a sort of a healthy mix that is needed to find out what the country's comparative advantages are and how to pursue them. I also see that, one of the long-term observers of Karabakh who has a celebrated book about this. Recently, Tom de Waal, he mentioned Agdam wine, right? That was cheap Agdam wine, right? Famous cheap Agdam wine. I remember from Soviet times that we had a friend from Russia, an old man, Dede Yura. When he would come to visit us and stay with us in summer, he would ask me to go fetch him Agdam. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say by this sort of anecdote is that there is also, Azerbaijan has, maybe not to a similar extent as Georgia, has some comparative advantage in wineries, right? In developing, that industry. Right? Unfortunately, it was pretty devastated by several blows. One by the blow of Nobel Prize winning last president of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, because Gorbachev decided that, well, actually it's better to take away those vineyards and develop some other sector. That was just one of the many Soviet sort of mistakes. I'm not going to go into that. There are a number of jokes about how Khrushchev did that and then Gorbachev did the same. So it has been Azerbaijan's alcoholic beverage industry has potential. It has endured some huge blows, but the potential is there. Now, how to develop that's a different question. Should the government say, oh, here's a winery A, B, C, and this is what we're going to do? Or it should be in sort of constructive dialogue, conversation with people who actually know how to do it, and then see where to take it from.
Yeah. No, thanks for answering these questions. Let's move to a couple of other questions regarding what we have been observing recently. Many Western experts think that Azerbaijan catastrophically lacks independent scholars, experts, opinion leaders who can publish their articles in top American, European newspapers, journals, give interviews to global media. Do you agree with this? Do you agree that there is such a problem? And if yes, what are the reasons for that?
Whether I agree with it, partially yes. But that I do not find the most important part of the question. I find the second part of the question much more important. Why is there such shortage? Now, let's clear the first question first. There is a visible lack of Azerbaijani voices in, let's focus on Western academia. By that, I mean Western European, North American, intellectual space and media space. Part of it has to do, of course you can compare, right? Perhaps it's better to compare. You say, well, for every Azerbaijani scholar that can get, into such and such outlet, there will be 10 Armenian intellectual scholars, think tank leaders, and so on. Now, it has, of course, structural reasons. Structural meaning, unlike Armenian diaspora, Azerbaijan's diaspora is much, much smaller. Second, Azerbaijan scholars have faced in the West some things that are very much similar to Soviet and generally Russian nationalities policies. What I mean is the same barriers to entry are visible in Western intellectual hierarchies. Okay? So now I'm jumping into the second question, but first let me finish the first part of the question. Is there a shortage or not? Partially yes, but partially no. Why no? Well, I can name you from the top of my head, and you can stop me 1 hour later. In 1 hour, I'll just continue giving you many names of bright and independent intellectuals, both within Azerbaijan and outside, who can talk about not only their area of expertise, but also beyond. And then we'll come back to this issue. This is very important, right? Because intellectual isn't necessarily someone who just knows a certain trade, right? They can just solve a series of equations and that's where it stops, right? An intellectual is someone who is able to go beyond. Now, inside Azerbaijan, there are a number of independent, for example, economists. So I know a number of them. Some of them recently are being heard by some people in the ruling elites, which is for me very good. They're not sufficiently heard. They're not sufficiently listened to, but there is some room for listening to them. From the top of my head, there is a group of economists led by Sabit Bagirov, Inqilab Ahmadov, Azer Mehdiev. They have economist circle, and there are sort of older generation of very shrewd, practical Azerbaijani economists, as well as a younger generation of bright, not necessarily Western educated. You don't have to be bright, brilliant, and good in what you're doing. You don't need Western education for that, right? This is also what my research shows. Now, there is that group of people outside of Azerbaijan. Again, I can name you, and you know some of them personally, right?
Please give us some names.
From my own circles, from people I know, from Farid Guliev, who is a bright political economist right now in Germany, to Leyla Ismailov, who is an associate professor at the University of Chicago, Leyla Karimli, who is an assistant professor at University of California at Los Angeles, Kamal Makili Aliyev in Sweden, and I can continue the list over and over again, right? These people are not only bright; they're not only good at what they're doing, but knowing some of them personally and having read what they write, these people offer breadth, right? These people have intellects that span several areas, right? So these people are a pleasure to talk with, and that's what you need in an intellectual. And most important, these people are independent, and no one can accuse them of bias. When these people are raising concern over what, let's say a celebrated British newspaper publishes, it's not because they are representing Azerbaijani government, or they are basically, representing a parochial provincial interest. No, they are just doing what they see as a just cause. If they see marginalization and exclusion of Azerbaijani academics and intellectuals and journalists and so on and so forth, what do you expect them to do? So coming back to the first question, is there a shortage? Partially yes, but partially no. Now, here's the second question, right? Why some Western observers perceive it as a catastrophic lack, as you put it, right? Well, just like in the proverb about beauty, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. The same here, right? It might not be a perfect analogy, but this people being relatively less visible might have to do with objective reasons. Objective reasons being, at every stage of their career, they face barriers that are not so different from the barriers that people from Muslim nationalities faced during Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. So there were informal hierarchies. If you are from Tajikistan, or if you are from Uzbekistan or Azerbaijan, or Tatarstan, you have glass ceiling. Now you hit something and then you don't understand why you're not being promoted, why you can't advance. Well, because there are glass ceilings. There are barriers that have to do with social capital, right? What networks you bring, who do you know? But social networks also depend on cultural capital, meaning, are you able to speak their language? Can you mix in a joke and, let's say, like a friend of mine in China says that one way of inducting a foreigner in party circles in China is to make them drink vodka, right? So if you endure that exercise, of course it's an exaggeration, but it shows that you need you need to be able to click. There needs to be chemistry. That chemistry, in larger terms, is called cultural capital. You need to be able to present yourself. You need to have manners, mannerisms, languages, things that you can share. You need to be able to relate to the same jokes as they do. Otherwise, you face that you cannot get the social capital, meaning you can't get the network that is needed to get up. So objective reasons are that there are those structural constraints that Azerbaijani scholars face at every stage outside. But there is also a subjective story, right? Meaning, if with all due respect towards people who say that there is a catastrophic lack of independent Azerbaijani voices, Azerbaijani intellectuals and journalists and so on who can make visible impact, well, isn't it partly because you don't see that? Isn't it partly because you might be carriers of certain views, even stereotypes, even prejudices, even biases that you are not aware of? The thing about bias is that when you have it, you usually don't see it. It's the same with privilege, right? If you ask many, many privileged people, they will not see that they are privileged. They think that what they have got is what they have earned. The catastrophic lack of independent scholars might be a perception that has to do with the biases and stereotypes that people who say those words have themselves, right? So maybe it has to do with your social network. Maybe it has to do with the cultural capital that you expect people to bring. If an Azerbaijani kid who comes and you tell a joke and you have let's say a Czech kid who relates to your joke because he has seen The Simpsons, but an Azerbaijani kid who is equally brilliant but who hasn't seen The Simpsons can't relate to that job, then if you prefer that Czech kid over the Azerbaijani kid, you are falling into the bias. Am I being...
Talking about bias, I think it's clear. Talking about bias, a lot of people in Azerbaijan, especially recently, complained about Western media being biased and anti-Azerbaijani. Would you agree with this? And if yes, why? If no, why?
My experience over the last several weeks has been similar. I have witnessed a number of times when it is extremely unclear how it was possible to have, for example, a venue given to a Western observer or an Armenian observer, but not someone from Azerbaijan. It was a recurring theme, right? Over and over again. Some outlets, very few, unfortunately, proved themselves. Basically, they re-established their reputation for many as impartial and balanced, right? So I'm thinking of, for example, New York Times, right? Which gave relatively balanced coverage, heard both voices, because the truth is that there is suffering, there is injustice on both sides. You need to understand that. Huh? But there have been some outlets that have been just completely oblivious to one side and have basically given voice to another side. And giving voice to legitimate grievances has to be celebrated. Right? So if someone writes about, destroying, the destruction of cultural heritage or potential war crimes and so on, it has to be celebrated. But if you do it one-sidedly, you are becoming a potential tool of propaganda. You are no longer serving the peace of the region. You're no longer serving justice. You're no longer serving the cause of ordinary people in the region, because, well, the truth is that these ordinary people, they're just getting so much information, they can't they cannot understand what's going on, right? So if you just provide one-sided information, not only you are doing the injustice of not giving voice to a visibly marginalized group, but you are also not doing something good for the people you think you're caring for. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
So the only group not the only one group, but it's the only broader group of people you're serving are people who were benefiting from the status quo, right? So it's, for example, if radical parts of Armenian diaspora, of course, there is constructive part, there are reasonable voices on both sides, right? But there are also radical parts of diaspora who have never probably been to Armenia. They don't know how ordinary Armenians live. For them, it's very easy to sit somewhere in a cozy place and, be a keyboard warrior and sort of basically dedicate your hours of bohemian lifestyle to create a propaganda that is only hurting people you think you care about. Now, Western media, when it's biased, it's whether it wants it or not, ends up lining up, ends up basically siding with this group of people.
One side against the other side.
Exactly, right? Now, what are the causes of this? Well, the causes of this are similar to what I was saying before, right? Now, if you look in more practical terms, so you need to disaggregate what's going on, right? Look at the outlets. Look at who editors are. I don't want to start a blame game. Oh yeah, look up an Armenian name there, right? It's a basic exercise. It might have some value, but that's not the whole story. The larger story is, okay, who are behind this outlet? What are their interests? What are their economic, political, variety of other interests? Who do they cater to? What is the audience that is buying these newspapers? But there are also the Western bias in, not the Western, but bias of a number of Western media outlets against Azerbaijan it has one major problem. The major problem is equating Azerbaijan with the government of Azerbaijan. If you have problems with how Azerbaijan's government has functioned, that is a legitimate concern of yours, but that doesn't give you a right to mix those two things and say, well, Azerbaijan is just like its government, right? And treat it as such. Do you follow what I'm trying to say, right? So even celebrated scholars like Noam Chomsky and Cornel West wrote this incredibly lopsided. They signed this incredibly lopsided letter, in which it basically portrayed 10 million Azerbaijanis as one coherent group of people. I find it incredibly discouraging when someone like Noam Chomsky and Cornel West does it, because Noam Chomsky in particular, who is also a friend of Edward Said, has always said, never essentialize people. Never think that, oh, this is a common thread connecting these millions of people. And that's what Orientalism is, right? It comes and says, oh, Western diplomat or Western journalist in 17th, 18th century would come and see some enigmatic essential things from everywhere, from Egypt to India, right? That connects these people. So if I can say it in relatively sort of straightforward terms, there are objective, structural, economic, political reasons for Western bias, Western media bias, or bias in Western media. But there are also a lot of ingrained, implicit stereotypes that are running through Western educational institutions that breed those journalists who later, when they write about these topics, they just don't see how biased they are, because many of them, let's say few of them, have emancipated themselves from this essentializing, narrow outlook at anything that is East. Very few of them have emancipated themselves from this narrow outlook, but many of them still have the stereotypes that you can find in 20th, 19th, 18th century literature, if you look at it, right? So things that Joseph Conrad, in his works about colonialism, has raised, you can see them now. They might be implicit. They might look less disturbing, but they're there. So to sort of summarize, the bias in Western media outlets has structural, that is economic, political reasons to it, but it also has a lot of cultural reasons to it. Because in order to be able to write unbiased, impartial work, you need to get rid of biases that you are carrying because of your socialization, because the way you've been educated, indoctrinated, and so on and so forth.
Thanks for these comprehensive answers. And maybe the last question, I really would like you to tell a little bit about yourself. What are you doing here in the Netherlands, and what are your plans in life and with your future career?
Well, I work and live here. I work at a university here. By the way, the views that are expressed in our conversation are my own, nothing to do with the university. So I research and teach and provide consulting internationally on topics of political and economic inequality.
So this is your topic, basically.
Yes, this is my topic, exactly. On the governance of natural resources, and on migration issues. So those are the three areas. And I also provide methodological training on public policy analysis. So how to sort of identify problems, how to sort of try to solve them in coherent, consistent, rigorous frameworks. So I teach research and provide consulting on these areas. And my plans are to just continue doing this. So I'm mostly enjoying parts of the work I do, and growing further is something that I'm looking forward to.
Anar, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.